Plato was born in 427 BCE in Athens, in one of its oldest and most distinguished families. As we saw in the last chapter, these were troubled times for Athens, which was suffering mounting losses in the Second Peloponnesian War. Pericles died in 429 BCE, after leading Athens in the war for 2 years. Athens's first overwhelming reversal came in 413 BCE, when its fleet was destroyed at Syracuse, and it was finally defeated by Sparta in 404 BCE. Both in 413 to 412 BCE and in 404 to 403 BCE, the democratic government of Athens was overthrown by oligarchic factions, which ruled for short periods. In 404 to 403 BCE, when Athens experienced a second year of civil strife, and the so-called tyranny of the 30 backed by Sparta established itself, Plato was invited to join the oligarchy, since some of the 30 tyrants were his relatives. Plato refused to have anything to do with this government. When the Democrats came back a year later, they began a wave of revenge punishments. These included judicial proceedings against Socrates and his subsequent execution, in 399 BCE. In shock and disgust at the death of his teacher, whom Plato revered as the wisest man in Athens, Plato left Athens and began his travels in Greece, Egypt, and Italy. Plato returned in 387 BCE to Athens, where he founded the Academy. After 20 years of running the Academy, he was invited, in 367 BCE, to the city-state of Syracuse in Italy to act as a political advisor. He made another trip to Syracuse in 361 BCE, but on both occasions his experience was an unhappy one and he had to flee from its ruler, Dionysius II. Except for these years, he mostly stayed in Athens, busy with his writing and teaching at the Academy. It is interesting to read about Plato's life in his own words in his 7th letter. 1. As we have already mentioned, the death of Socrates had a great impact on Plato. Plato considered himself to be Socrates' student, and he had great respect and admiration for his teacher. Socrates influenced him to such an extent that most of his dialogues are written as conversations between Socrates and other notable citizens of Athens. Socrates is the main protagonist of Plato's dialogues. In fact, since Socrates did not leave any writings of his own, much of what we know today about Socrates is through the Platonic corpus. Socrates and the eudaemonist axiom Socrates, who was probably born in 470 BCE and died in 399 BCE, lived when Athenian culture was at its zenith. Not only was he a contemporary of Pericles, he also lived during the time of the great Athenian dramatists, Sophocles and Euripides, whose plays we still read today. Just as their tragedies focused on human dilemmas, similarly Socrates was responsible for turning the philosophic gaze away from natural philosophy to moral philosophy. Whereas Ionian philosophers like Thales and Anaximander were interested in investigating the composition of nature, Socrates insisted that philosophers should pay attention to questions of human conduct, such as how human beings could live good lives. This was the central question bequeathed by Socrates to his followers. In the development of Greek thought, Socrates is said to be the first to establish the eudaemonist foundation of ethical theory. Socrates did this through his eudaemonist axiom that happiness, eudaimonia in Greek, is desired by all human beings as the ultimate end of all their rational acts. 3. If the goal of human life is eudaimonia or happiness, what kind of life should individuals live, in order to be happy? Do we all wish to do well in the world? Since we all wish to do well, how could we do well? If we had plenty of good things, if we had plenty of good things, we should be happy and do well. For to be happy, to live the good life, do we need the goods of wealth, health, handsomeness, other bodily blessings, good birth and power and honor in one's country, temperateness, uprightness, bravery, wisdom and good fortune? 5. Socrates' answer was that it was actually a life of arete, virtue, that was essential for happiness. Socrates believed that everything had a specific function or goal. The function of a knife, for instance, is to cut things. To perform its function well, a thing needs a special quality or virtue. For example, to be able to cut well, the knife needs to be sharp, that is, the excellence or virtue of a knife consists in its sharpness. Analogically, if the goal of human beings is to live well or happily, they also need specific virtues or excellences in order to achieve this goal. Point 6. For much of the Greek tradition, happiness was not so much a state of mind, as a certain kind of activity which was constitutive of it. In the Greek word eudaimon, eu means well and daimon means divinity or spirit. To be eudaimon is therefore to be living in a way that is well favored by a god. Point 7. This is why well-being or flourishing are often proposed as less misleading translations of eudaimonia. Thus, according to Socrates, happiness, that is living a good life, means acting virtuously. Point 8. For Socrates, virtue is related to happiness, not merely in an instrumental fashion. Happiness is not merely a consequence of virtue. Something which is opposed to virtue cannot also achieve happiness for us. Socrates believed that happiness means acting virtuously. Virtue is the only constituent of happiness. Virtue is happiness, the whole of it. 9. Thus, happiness is virtue. Moreover, Socrates held that non-moral goods like health and wealth were not irrelevant for happiness. As long as they were conjoined with virtue, a healthy life and physical comfort could increase our happiness. 10. If the answer to the question, how can I live well or make myself happy, is, by being virtuous, then we have to ask, what is virtue? What is interesting is that by making happiness dependent on virtue, Socrates seemingly forestalled the conflict between one person's happiness and another's. If being virtuous means being oriented to the interests of others, then the same virtuous action would make the doer of that action, as well as others, happy. The Greeks believed that the capacity for the four cardinal virtues courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance was given to everyone because it is necessary for social life. One of the Greek myths that Plato relates in the Protagoras, was that when human beings were created, they were made weaker than animals and therefore, had to try to live together in order to be able to deal with the stronger animals. They sought therefore to save themselves by coming together and founding fortified cities, but when they gathered in communities they injured one another for want of political skill, and so scattered again and continued to be devoured. Zeus therefore, fearing the total destruction of our race, sent Hermes to impart to men the qualities of respect for others and a sense of justice, so as to bring order into our cities, and create a bond of friendship and union. 11. The virtues, being required for any collective endeavor, become necessary for individual happiness. This was the customary way of linking virtue with individual happiness. What we have to see is whether for Socrates, too, this was the route through which virtue became happiness or living well. In Plato's dialogues, various notable citizens of Athens invariably encounter Socrates, who poses questions to them regarding the nature of virtue. One of these questions was whether virtue is one thing or many. Socrates believed in the unity of all virtue, claiming that a courageous man would also be wise, just and temperate. All the virtues went together. From the idea of the unity of virtue, follows the other Socratic principle, that virtue is knowledge. If a wise man cannot but be brave, this implies that we are cowardly only because of our ignorance. If we knew about the value and the meaning of virtue, we would not act immorally. Having given us these hints about virtue, Socrates went on to ask questions about the acquisition of virtue or, rather, about the acquisition of knowledge of virtue. The Socratic Elenchus. How did Socrates find out the answers to these questions about virtue? The distinctive Socratic method of investigation of moral questions has been termed the Socratic elenchus, which means cross-examination. Socrates was, famous for stopping anywhere on the streets of Athens, in the marketplace or at somebody's house, and beginning a discussion on the meaning of beauty, truth, or virtue. Such a discussion would usually begin with Socrates asking others their definition of, say, beauty. Subsequently, Socrates would ask his interlocutor to explain the meaning of the different aspects of his definition and through this cross-examination, get him to accept that there was an inconsistency in his definition of beauty, and thereby move the argument forward. The basic structure of a typical elenchus is simple. Socrates asks a question, either a request to be told what some virtue is, for instance, what is bravery, or some other question about a virtue. The interlocutor affirms some proposition P in answer to Socrates' initial question. Under Socrates' questioning he agrees that he also believes Q and R, and he discovers, under further questioning, that not P can be derived from Q and R, hence he finds that his beliefs commit him to P and not P. Finding himself in this situation, he is at a loss, aporian, about what to believe. 12. The Socratic method of investigation was dialogic, and knowledge of what is beauty or love was sought to be gained through this dialogic process. The dialogic process was so important to Socrates that he refused to put his thoughts down in writing. The historical Socrates did not write. He did not write because he believed that the real value of philosophizing lay in the responsive interaction of teacher and pupil, as the teacher guides the pupil by questioning to become more aware of his own beliefs and their relationship to one another. Books lack the attentiveness and responsiveness of true philosophical teaching. 13. No wonder, then, that we have to depend on Plato's writings to become familiar with Socratic ideas. Our most familiar image of Socrates is drawn from Plato's many dialogues. According to Christopher Rowe, the Socrates who is the main speaker in most of Plato's dialogues has certain marked distinguishing features. He is drawn to beautiful young men and adolescent boys, while he himself is, by usual standards, remarkably ugly. He knows nothing, but can outsmart anyone he meets. In spite of saying he knows nothing, he goes on saying and evidently believing a number of extremely odd things. No one goes wrong willingly, all the virtues are one, all desire is for the good, and so on. He specializes in question and answer, but is usually the questioner. He can drink anyone under the table, but never gets drunk. He is courageous, hardy, typically goes barefoot, and so on. 14. Scholars disagree over whether and when in his dialogues, Plato moved away from Socrates' teachings and began to develop his own philosophical position. For Gregory Velastos, the Platonic dialogues are populated by not one but two Socrates, and only one of them is the historical Socrates. In his early Elenctic dialogues, Plato gives us a picture of this dialogic Socrates. However, from Republic, Book 2 onwards, a different Socrates begins to appear. Velastos has listed 10 differences between these two Socrates, whereas the Socrates of the early Platonic dialogues seeks knowledge elenctically but keeps avowing that he knows nothing. The Socrates of the later Platonic dialogues seeks demonstrative knowledge and is confident of finding it. The earlier Socrates' method of philosophical investigation is adversative. He pursues moral truth by refuting theses defended by dissenting interlocutors. The later Socrates is a didactic philosopher, expounding truth to consenting interlocutors. The earlier Socrates' conception of philosophy is populist, that of the later Socrates is elitist. The later Socrates has an elaborate political theory while the earlier one has no such theory. 15. Is either of the two Socrates of the Platonic dialogues the real Socrates? Velastos's position is that the Socrates of the early dialogues is the historical Socrates. Until the time when these early dialogues were written, Plato believed in the Socratic method of Elenchus. In his middle period, Plato began to give up many of Socrates' beliefs, and the new Socrates of the middle and later dialogues represents Plato's own turn away from the historical Socrates. Velastos's position is contested by Rowe, for whom Plato remained deeply Socratic till the end, and therefore continued to use Socrates as the main speaker even in his later dialogues. For Rowe, Plato remains Socratic in his focus on rational knowledge as leading us to virtue. 16. Plato's political theory. Plato is the only one among all the political philosophers we will read about in this book, to have left us all his writings in the form of dialogues, 35 of which are extant or still available to us. 17. Some scholars of Greek political theory, like Velastos, believed, as we just said, that Plato's thought changed radically by the time he wrote the middle dialogues, like Republic. Other commentators have argued for a unity in Plato's philosophical position, reflected in a continuity especially between his early and middle dialogues. 18. It is pointed out, that though Plato never speaks in his own voice in the dialogues, and the dramatis personae is always someone other than Plato, Socrates, Gorgias, Cephalus, Glaucon, Alcibiades, and so many others, the author is always Plato. It is in the entire writing that the author speaks to us, not in the remarks made by individual speakers. 19. As the author, Plato may have deliberately constructed his early dialogues as aporetic, not only to give us a picture of the historical Socrates, but also in order to use these early dialogues to create a setting for his own philosophical position in Republic. We should also consider why Plato spent so much of his creative energy in composing the dialogic form to express his philosophical positions. Plato's dialogues all have different settings and are usually presented as recountings, as a result of which, a major role is played by the narrator's memory. In Symposium, for instance, the person remembering the dialogue and recounting it to his friend, has actually heard it from another friend, in whose memory the dialogue has stayed for 20 years or so. One wonders whether all these features are a part of Plato's political analysis. In another instance, when Plato makes the port of Piraeus the setting of the conversation on justice in Republic, in our interpretation of the same, are we to consider the fact that Piraeus was the base of the democratic opposition against the 30 tyrants of 404 BCE, that Polemarchus was the main financial backer of this democratic opposition, and that it was at the temple of Bendis, the goddess whose celebration brings Socrates to the Piraeus in Republic, that the decisive battle took place in which the 30 were defeated by the democratic faction, 20 we left Socrates debating questions of happiness and virtue, and of the knowledge of virtue, and we might now ask what such questions have to do with political philosophy. The art concerned with the soul I call the political art. 21 states Socrates in Gorgias. For Socrates, just as knowing how to make a body healthy is an art, namely, the art of medicine, and being able to guide ships from one harbor to another is an art, namely the art of navigation, similarly, the knowledge of how to make someone virtuous is an art. Socrates sees himself as practicing the political art of making his fellow citizens virtuous. I think that I am one of very few Athenians, not to say the only one, engaged in the true political art, and that of the men of today I alone practice statesmanship. 22 Here, Socrates is responding to the accusation that he is apolitical. Plato never portrays Socrates making a speech in the ecclesia. In that sense, Socrates' conversations were always private, in the houses of friends or in the marketplace. Since virtue, by harmonizing the happiness of a group of people, is the foundation of any collective life, then, by focusing his discussions constantly on virtue, was not Socrates engaging in political inquiry? By convincing everyone that they must never indulge in acts of injustice, Socrates was teaching them the elements of citizenship. 23 Trying to make his own sense of the Socratic questions of eudaimonia and errate, Plato's answers are given more in terms of politics. Plato turned the questions of individual happiness and individual virtue into one of their relationship with different political arrangements. Whether we organize our political institutions in the form of a democracy or an aristocracy, how this will impact the ability of individuals to gain knowledge of virtue and to live virtuous lives, these seem to be Plato's questions, not Socrates's. If virtue leads to, or is happiness, and virtue is constituted of justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom, we have to, for example, not merely be convinced about not doing injustice, but to find out what justice exactly is. Plato will begin to examine the idea of justice, in Republic, by pointing to its political dimension. Plato's Republic, which he wrote in his middle age, is used all over the world, to introduce political science undergraduates to Plato. Statesmen and Laws, written by Plato when he was much older, are other important dialogues for students of political philosophy. But I would like to begin this discussion with two of Plato's early dialogues, Apology and Crito. Both these dialogues cover Socrates' trial and punishment, and the two poles of Plato's political philosophy are clearly revealed here. Plato's mature political position of Republic seems to be prefigured in these early dialogues. Apology is a dialogue between Socrates and his accusers. Charged with leading Athenian young men astray with his discussions, Socrates explains that all that he was doing was trying to find out for himself the truth of the proclamation of the Delphic oracle that Socrates was the wisest man of Athens. This is the first principle of Platonic philosophy: one's individual reason is the final authority over oneself. Plato shows us Socrates refusing to accept the authority of the oracle, a semi-divine entity, and going about asking people questions about what they know, to find out whether they are wiser than him. Socrates says that he first sought out the poets and the artisans, for such persons were traditionally seen as knowledgeable individuals in Athens, but he was not satisfied with their answers. Religious knowledge, in the form of the oracle, had already been considered as insufficient by him. During his trial, when he is offered forgiveness on the condition that he will cease to have his infamous discussions, Socrates categorically refuses. The life of reason, by which Plato means a life of individual questioning and of seeking for the truth, is the only life worth living. As Socrates says in his own words, "Gentlemen, so long as I draw breath and have my faculties, I shall never stop practicing philosophy and exhorting you and elucidating the truth for everyone that I meet. I spend all my time going about trying to persuade you, young and old, to make your first and chief concern not for your bodies nor for your possessions, but for the higher welfare of your souls, proclaiming as I go, wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth and every other blessing, both to the individual and to the state." Towards the end of his defense, we find Socrates saying that to let no day pass without discussing goodness and all the other subjects about which you hear me talking and examining both myself and others is really the very best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living. Point 24. Here, Socrates is linking virtue with both private and public good, as well as claiming that knowledge of virtue can only be achieved through a rational discussion conducted with others. What happens in Crito? Here we see Socrates in jail, waiting for his execution. His friend, Crito, comes to visit him and tells him of a plan for his escape. His friends will spirit him out of jail, out of Athens, and he can live the rest of his life in exile in another city-state. Again, Socrates categorically refuses and explains his decision in the following manner. Whatever he is, he says, is because of his native city, which has nourished him both physically and intellectually. In return, he has certain obligations to his city, to his political community, one of them being speaking out against any unjust practices of the city. Socrates accepts that an individual's reason develops by participating in the life of the city, and yet, that an individual's reason can be used to judge the practices of the community. If one has not spoken out against an unjust law when it was applied to others, and not tried to change it, one has no right to run away when the unjust law is applied to oneself. This is the other pole of Plato's political philosophy, the importance of the political community to an individual's moral and intellectual development and the almost sacredness of one's obligations to it. Personifying the laws, Plato has them reproach Socrates in the following way: "Socrates, although we have brought you into the world and reared you and educated you, and given you and your fellow citizens a share in all the good things at our disposal, nevertheless by the very fact of granting our permission we openly proclaim this principle, that any Athenian, on attaining to manhood and seeing for himself the political organization of the state and us its laws, is permitted, if he is not satisfied with us, to take his property and go away wherever he likes. If any one of you stands his ground when he can see how we administer justice and the rest of our public organization, we hold that by so doing he has in fact undertaken to do anything that we tell him. Anyone who disobeys is guilty, because, after promising obedience, he is neither obeying us nor persuading us to change our decision if we are at fault in any way. And although all our orders are in the form of proposals, not of savage commands, and we give him the choice of either persuading us or doing what we say, he is, and you are actually doing neither. Point 25. These two aspects of Plato's thought, as represented in Apology and Crito, both early dialogues, come together uneasily in Republic. Which kind of city, political community, is it that develops our rationality, our ability to know virtue, and what is the extent of our obligation to it? To answer this question, Plato constructed Republic as a dialogue between Socrates and his friends, ostensibly on a specific virtue, that of justice. Returning to Athens after witnessing a religious procession at Piraeus, the harbor, Socrates and company are stopped by Polemarchus and invited to his house, where they engage in a discussion of justice. As in the earlier dialogues, Socrates' method is first to examine existing conceptions of justice. Only when he has shown that the knowledge of justice of Polemarchus, Thrasymachus, Glaucon, and Adeimantus is rife with contradictions, does he give us his own conception of justice. He sets out to meet Glaucon's challenge to prove that justice is the fairest of goods, that which is good not only because of its consequences but which is good in itself. Box 2.1. The challenge to Socrates on justice: they say that to do injustice is, by nature, good, to suffer injustice, evil, but that the evil is greater than the good. And so when men have both done and suffered injustice and have had experience of both, not being able to avoid the one and obtain the other, they think that they had better agree among themselves to have neither, hence there arise laws and mutual covenants, and that which is ordained by law is termed by them lawful and just. This they affirm to be the origin and nature of justice. It is a mean or compromise, between the best of all, which is to do injustice and not be punished, and the worst of all, which is to suffer injustice without the power of retaliation, and justice, being at a middle point between the two, is tolerated not as a good, but as the lesser evil, and honored by reason of the inability of men to do injustice. For no man who is worthy to be called a man would ever submit to such an agreement if he were able to resist, he would be met if he did. Such is the received account, Socrates, of the nature and origin of justice. Now that those who practice justice do so involuntarily and because they have not the power to be unjust will best appear if we imagine something of this kind, having given both to the just and the unjust power to do what they will, let us watch and see whither desire will lead them, then we shall discover in the very act the just and unjust man to be proceeding along the same road, following their interest, which all natures deem to be their good, and are only diverted into the path of justice by the force of law. Republic, Book 2. Socrates says he will answer the question of who is a just individual by describing what justice is in the city. The question of the just individual is the same as the Socratic question of the virtuous individual, since justice was, as we saw earlier, one of the 4 cardinal Greek virtues. But Plato offers us an interesting twist here. To find out about the virtuous individual, we have to examine the just political community, thus, moving from moral philosophy in the direction of political science. Here, the dialogic quality of republic comes to an end and a long monologue begins on what justice is, in the city. First, Socrates explains how a city comes into being. The first political community, he says, is established when a farmer, a craftsman, a blacksmith, and other such like individuals get together. None of these men can efficiently fulfill all their needs by themselves. Therefore, it is more sensible if they each specialize in their own tasks and exchange goods and services with others, to fulfill their various requirements. As their needs increase and cannot be fulfilled internally, the members of the community turn aggressive and begin to prey on other communities. This is when the need arises for another specialization, the guardians. It is the guardians who will defend the city against external attacks and also maintain internal law and order. Plato's full-blown city, containing the 3 classes of the farmers and the craftsmen, the auxiliaries, or soldiers, and the philosophers, is built, then, on the twin principles of interdependence and specialization. The philosophers and the soldiers, together called the guardians, depend on the farmers for their food and other material needs. The farmers depend on the guardians for protection and guidance. The farmers have the ability to do the work of production, the soldiers are those with military skill, and the philosophers are the ones with the most developed reasoning powers. The Athenians believed that they were autochthonous, children of the soil they lived on, and not the descendants of ancestors who came from other lands. It was this illusion that Plato was playing on in his myth of the metals and republic. 26 Plato makes Socrates ask the guardians to spread this noble lie among the farmers of the Callipolis, or the ideal city, that the earth was their mother, and as children of the earth, they were born with some metallic component in their bodies. Some were born with gold in their bodies, those meant to be philosophers, others with silver, those meant to be auxiliaries, and some with brass, those meant to be farmers. This noble lie would serve 2 purposes. It would make every man believe that he was part of a bigger family with all the other members being his brothers, and it would also lead everyone to accept their station in life as natural, as suited to the qualities they were born with. This is also where Plato's theory of the individual psyche fits in. Here we find Plato fleshing out a conception of human nature that underlies the concept of virtue and justice. After all, if making individuals virtuous is an art, then as in the other arts, the practitioner of this art must also know the nature of her material, in this case, human nature. Plato begins by saying that the same forms and qualities are to be found in each one of us that are in the state 27 because the state is made up, after all, of individuals. For Plato, just as the city contains 3 groups, a person's soul, which is always superior to his body, is also made up of three elements. The lowest element consists of the appetites, which is followed by the spirited part of the soul, and the highest element is the rational part of the soul. Plato names that in the soul whereby it reckons and reasons the rational, and that with which it loves, hungers, thirsts, and feels the flutter and titillation of other desires, the irrational and appetitive. 28 Our appetites are often in conflict with our reason. Plato believed that our reason is able to control our unruly appetites with the help of the spirited part of our soul. When his desires constrain a man contrary to his reason and he reviles himself and is angry with that within which masters him, and that as it were in a faction of two parties the high spirit of such a man becomes the ally of his reason. 29 Every individual must keep his appetites and spirit under the control of his reason. Plato also believed that in some individuals the appetites were dominant, in others, spirit, and in a few individuals, reason. Those individuals who lived for their appetites should farm, the spirited ones should be auxiliaries, and the ones who lived for reason should be philosophers. This was not a caste system, because Plato clearly stated that a child with the potential of becoming a farmer could be born to a philosopher and vice versa. For Plato, children show their potential as they go through the educational system, and according to their capabilities, they should receive further training. Although there is some controversy about whether Plato advocated a state-run educational system for the children of all the classes, or only for those of the guardians, it seems reasonable to believe that he wanted all children to be educated in schools run by the state, since he believed that it is through this education that they learn what justice is. After about 12 years of compulsory education in music and gymnastics, only some of them are given military training. After 2 years of military training, a second division takes place, and again, only a few of the 20-year-olds go ahead into a rigorous program of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and dialectics. Plato's conception of justice, then, flows from his vision of the political community. Justice, he shows, is that which serves the common interest. Even a den of thieves requires principles of justice if it is to sustain itself. In any common endeavor, there must be a fair distribution of the fruits of that endeavor, if the project is to continue, and it is the principles of justice that will define what this fair distribution is. A state is a common effort by a number of individuals. Hence, every state requires principles of justice as its foundation. The individual members of any state must be convinced that their state is a just state, and they must follow the principles of justice of their particular state. Having convinced us of the centrality of justice, Plato gave us his specific principles of justice, which have to do with the earlier mentioned ideas of interdependence and specialization. For a successful political community, the functions of production, protection, and statesmanship are to be adequately fulfilled. Therefore, justice requires that some individuals take up farming, others become soldiers, and some others become philosopher rulers. Plato imagined a community in which some individuals, those in whom the appetites are dominant, have an aptitude for farming, others, with more than usual spirit, become soldiers, and a few who live for reason, become philosophers. In this manner, the principles of justice ensure that not only is the common interest served, with individuals fulfilling their obligations to the political community, but that the happiness of these individuals is also served because of the harmony between what they do, what they get, and their individual psyches. It is important to remember here, that Plato specified that the producing class gets to enjoy the benefits of private property and family life. This class lives the life of the appetites, so it is part of Platonic justice that not only does it do the work of production, but it also enjoys the fruits of wealth and emotional fulfillment in a nuclear family. The guardians, whose appetites are weak, have no interest in the above, so they get to live in common barracks and have common meals with no family life. This is also part of Platonic justice. So, now we know how responsibilities and rewards will be distributed in a just city. What about the original Socratic/Platonic question of who is a just/virtuous individual? A just individual is one who does his job, and does not interfere in another's work, one who does not take more than his share, and does not take another's share. To do one's own business and not to be a busybody is justice. Justice is this principle of everyone doing his own task. Justice is when no one shall have what belongs to others or be deprived of his own. It is the having and doing of one's own and what belongs to oneself. Point 30. A farmer will be just if he does the work of production and does not try to involve himself in political decision-making. An auxiliary will be just if he fulfills his military function and does not hanker after wealth. Platonic justice confines the life of reason to the philosophers. Plato also claims that when an individual's soul is in harmony, that is, when his reason, spirit, and appetite are in the right relationship to each other, he will not overstep his bounds. Each of us, also in whom the several parts within him perform each their own task, he will be a just man and one who minds his own affair. 31. Such a man will not embezzle any deposits entrusted to him, nor will he indulge in theft or betray his comrades or his state. 32. Thus, justice means not only sticking to one's own job, but also being fair. Justice, thereby, prevents any harm coming to the state. If what we pronounce to be injustice is that which works the greatest harm to one's own state, then justice becomes whatever is good for the state. Here, Plato is showing us the good consequences of justice. Yet, just a little later we find Plato claiming the truth of the matter to be that justice is something not in regard to the doing of one's own business externally, but with regard to that which is within and in the true sense concerns one's self, and the things of one's self. It means that a man must not suffer the principles of his soul to do each the work of some other and interfere and meddle with one another. 33. This has led some commentators to accuse Plato of using the idea of justice to refer only to something intrapersonal, see box 2.2. Justice, here, is only a relationship to the self, and has nothing to do with interpersonal relations. The concept of the ideal state is just an analogy for Plato, a story with no independent meaning of its own. Box 2.2. Plato on the just individual, but in reality justice was such as we were describing, being concerned however, not with the outward man, but with the inward, which is the true self and concernment of man, for the just man does not permit the several elements within him to interfere with one another, or any of them to do the work of others. He sets in order his own inner life, and is his own master and his own law, and at peace with himself, and when he has bound together the three principles within him, which may be compared to the higher, lower, and middle notes of the scale, and the intermediate box 2. Two intervals, when he has bound all these together, and is no longer many, but has become one entirely temperate and perfectly adjusted nature, then he proceeds to act, if he has to act, whether in a matter of property, or in the treatment of the body, or in some affair of politics or private business, always thinking and calling that which preserves and cooperates with this harmonious condition, just and good action, and the knowledge which presides over it, wisdom, and that which at any time impairs this condition, he will call unjust action, and the opinion which presides over it ignorance. Republic, Book 4. Other scholars, taking the story of the ideal state much more seriously, point out that if the Socratic concept of virtue points to the link between the happiness of an individual and the happiness of others, the Platonic concept of justice specifies this link as a distribution of work and benefits. Such a just distribution leads to the happiness of all. Plato has been lauded down the ages for his insight, that the concept of justice, by leading to the happiness of all, becomes an essential requirement for any stable political community. His specific conception of justice, however, has often been criticized as organic and inegalitarian. For instance, terming it as a conception of functional reciprocity, according to which each member of a city has a right to those, and only those, socially distributable benefits, which will maximize his contribution, his work or function. 34. Velastos accuses Plato of sacrificing the interests of the individual in the name of justice in the city. Defending Plato's conception of justice, other scholars argue that if Plato is interpreted as wanting to show that justice as a virtue leads to happiness, Plato's interest is how to make a city virtuous and happy. 35. Then Plato would not have thought of benefits as entitlements only in compensation for contribution, not regarding the individual members of the political community only or primarily as contributors, but rather as subjects whose well-being matters. 36. Plato used the distributive principle that of citizens receiving whatever goods they are capable of benefiting from. Citizens are not benefited in compensation for their contribution. The relationship between contribution and benefit is actually the reverse of compensation. You contribute what you do because of the goods you have received, but you received the goods you did because of your ability to benefit from them, and not by the contribution you made. 37. Platonic rationalism. So far, we have concentrated on one central aspect of Platonic political philosophy, which is the importance of the political community, focusing on justice. When we examine Plato's conception of the philosopher, rulers more carefully, we come across the other pole of Plato's philosophy, the importance he gave to reason. Let us first examine Plato's advocacy of the coming together of philosophy and politics in the form of the philosopher kings and queens, in greater detail. Box 2.3. Plato on the need for uniting political power and knowledge, until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, and those commoner natures who pursue either to the exclusion of the other are compelled to stand aside, cities will never have rest from their evils nor the human race, as I believe, and then only will this our state have a possibility of life and behold the light of day. Republic, Book V. Influenced by the Socratic dictum that virtue is knowledge, Plato believed that political ills and injustice can be eradicated, if knowledgeable people are put at the helm of a city-state's politics. The philosophers are knowledgeable because they are the ones who undergo the educational process. Thus, they are the only ones who have knowledge of the ideas of the good, justice, beauty, truth, courage and the other moral attributes. Plato called these ideas forms. He believed that each entity that exists in our world is an imperfect copy of the form of that thing existing in a transcendental realm. These forms can be seen only by those with a rational mind. The philosophers can see the form of justice, therefore, they can ensure that justice in the city-state matches that form as much as possible. Box 2.4. 38. Plato on the good as the object of knowledge. Now, that which imparts truth to the known and the power of knowing to the knower is what I would have you term the idea of good, and this you will deem to be the cause of science, and of truth in so far as the latter becomes the subject of knowledge, beautiful too, as are both truth and knowledge. You will box 2.4 be right in esteeming this other nature as more beautiful than either, and, as in the previous instance, light and sight may be truly said to be like the sun, and yet not to be the sun, so in this other sphere, science and truth may be deemed to be like the good, but not the good has a place of honor yet higher. Republic, Book 6. Not only do the philosophers have the right kind of knowledge, they are best suited for the job of ruling because they have no private interests. Plato did not allow his guardian class anything private. Plato argued that it is easier for an individual to go against the common interest, not for his own sake, but for the sake of his family. To avoid this possibility, Plato disallowed the guardians to have a family. None of the guardians were to know which of the children they collectively lived with were born from their own flesh. They were to consider themselves the parents of all the children, and similarly the children would think that they have many mothers and fathers. The guardians were not to live in individual houses but in common barracks and to own no personal property except perhaps a few articles of clothing, etc. Their basic needs for simple food and clothing were to be met by provisions produced by the farmers. Of the guardians, the philosophers are best suited to rule because reason is dominant in their soul. This brings us to the issue of Plato's rationalism. The most important aspect of Plato's philosophy is his rationalism. For him, reason ruled the world, not God. For the Greeks, even the gods had to follow the rational laws of nature, and were punished if they transgressed these laws. Human beings have the capacity to understand this rational order, if they develop their intellectual capacities by training in mathematics and dialectics. For Plato, the goal of human life was a life of reason. A rational individual spends his life contemplating and accepts no authority save his own reason. What is reason? How does an individual gain knowledge of the rational order? Unlike in Crito, Plato no longer seems to believe that one's reason develops in the midst of one's political community, even if it is a just city. The philosopher can only gain knowledge by removing himself from the political community. This message comes across in Republic, in Plato's analogies of the cave and of the divided line. The cave is a metaphor for the illusionary world of politics, and only those few who are able to get out of the cave are able to use their reason to gain knowledge. Similarly, the divided line separates the world of becoming, that is, the world of politics and of change, from the world of being, and it is only by transcending the world of becoming that one can use one's reason to gain knowledge of the forms. Knowledge of the forms, rather than rhetoric, is political knowledge. We can refer here to the ship of the state simile used in Republic, where Plato construes the Athenian demos, people, as the hapless owner of a wayward ship, and where the ship operates as a representation of the state. The ignorant and indisciplined sailors, who are the ship's crew, are like the Athenian politicians who use their rhetorical powers to persuade the ship owner, the demos, to let his ship, the polis, be under their charge, even though they have no knowledge of navigation, statecraft. They laugh at the navigator, who actually knows how to guide the ship, because he is gazing at the sky and the stars. Plato reminds us that the true pilot must give his attention to the time of the year, the seasons, the sky, the winds, the stars, and all that pertains to his art if he is to be a true ruler of a ship. 39 At the beginning of the chapter, we noted that Socrates turned the philosophic gaze downwards from the heavens, nature, towards human beings on earth. Here, Plato seems to be discounting that because his philosopher, who has political knowledge, remains after all a thinker on things in the sky. 40 The development of reason no longer takes place in dialogic interaction with other members of the community, but in the contemplation of something that already exists outside the community, that is, the forms. No longer do true definitions of moral concepts appear in public discourse. What is interesting in Republic is that on the one hand, Plato is contemptuous of the elements of a private life, like private property, a family, etc., all of which according to him, denotes selfishness. A philosopher is meant to be devoted to the public good and must stay away from the private life. On the other hand, the philosopher's method of gaining knowledge contemplating the good seems very private. Of course, the individual has to fulfill his obligations to the political community. The philosophers must turn from their quest for knowledge to reform the community, but their knowledge is no longer indebted to the community. We seem to have arrived at a paradox. Here, regarding the concept of virtue, it remains, for Plato, essential for the community, but gaining knowledge of virtue is now, to a large extent, divorced from a life in the community. Box 2.5. Plato's views on the demos. Imagine then a fleet or a ship in which there is a captain who is taller and stronger than any of the crew, but he is a little deaf and has a similar infirmity in sight, and his knowledge of navigation is not much better. The sailors are quarreling with one another about the steering. Everyone is of opinion that he has a right to steer, though he has never learned the art of navigation and cannot tell who taught him or when he learned, and will further assert that it cannot be taught, and they are ready to cut in pieces anyone who says the contrary. They throng about the captain, begging and praying him to commit the helm to them, and if at any time they do not prevail, but others are preferred to them, they kill the others or throw them overboard, and having first chained up the noble captain's senses with drink or some narcotic drug, they mutiny and take possession of the ship and make free with the stores. Thus, eating and drinking, they proceed on their voyage in such a manner as might be expected of them. Him who is their partisan and cleverly aids them in their plot for getting the ship out of the captain's hands into their own, whether by force or persuasion, they compliment with the name of sailor, pilot, able seaman, and abuse the other sort of man, whom they call a good for nothing, but that the true pilot must pay attention to the year and seasons and sky and stars and winds, and whatever else belongs to his art, if he intends to be really qualified for the command of a ship, and that he must and will be the steerer, whether other people like or not. The possibility of this union of authority with the steerer's art has never seriously entered into their thoughts or been made part of their calling. Now in vessels which are in a state of mutiny and by sailors who are mutineers, how will the true pilot be regarded? Will he not be called by them a prater, a stargazer, a good for nothing? Republic, Book 6. The philosophers use their knowledge of virtue to demand that the practices of their community need to be reformed radically. Take the case, for example, of gender relations. Plato states, first of all, that in terms of reason, the relevant difference is not between men and women, but between some men and women and other men and women. Since some women have reason dominating their souls just as some men do, these women can become philosopher queens after the requisite training in dialectics. If women are to be philosopher rulers, they must also get the same early education in gymnastics and music. One can imagine the reaction to Plato's idea that young Athenian women were to exercise naked in public just as young Athenian men did, given that Athens was an extremely patriarchal society with women living in secluded quarters. Plato also points out that those women, who are meant for a life of philosophy, cannot waste their time rearing children and doing housework. Plato's proposals regarding gender relations were radical, as were his plans for revamping the Athenian educational system. Similarly, Plato's idea that philosophers must rule went against the democratic politics of the day. All these proposals show Plato's reason standing in judgment on Athenian social and political customs. Box 2.6. Plato on the ability of men and women to do the same things. You agree then, I said, that men and women are to have a common way of life such as we have described, common education, common children, and they are to watch over the citizens in common, whether abiding in the city or going out to war. They are to keep watch together, and to hunt together like dogs, and always and in all things, as far as they are able, women are to share with the men. And in so doing they will do what is best, and will not violate, but preserve the natural relation of the sexes. Republic, Book V. Plato's later political dialogues. Plato's political thought is often divided into three periods: the early Socratic dialogues, the middle period, and the later political dialogues like Statesmen and Laws. The radical edge of Plato's political theory of republic is said to be lost in Laws, which opens with a conversation between three men, an Athenian stranger, Clinias from Crete and Megillus from Sparta, who are discussing the founding of a Greek colony in Magnesia in southern Crete. Socrates is completely missing from this dialogue, in which the Athenian stranger is asked by the others to lay out his proposals for the social and political structures of the new colony. The new colony is to be settled by a small number of male citizens, only 5,040, and they are to live there with their families, their slaves, as well as with medics and other visiting aliens. The male citizens are to be gentlemen farmers, while handicrafts and trading are to the occupations of the medics. The citizens are to be divided into 12 tribes and into 4 property classes. In terms of political structure, the highest body is the Nocturnal Council, consisting of the wisest men of Magnesia. Below it is another small body, called the Guardians of the Laws, 10 of whose members are also part of the Nocturnal Council. Below that is an Executive Council of 360, as well as the Assembly, which was attended by all citizens. Most of the public offices are filled by election, although a small number are also filled by lottery. The rich are strictly fined for not attending the assembly. There is also a scrutiny that every official has to undergo at the end of his tenure. This seems a far cry from the philosopher kings and queens of republic, who were such embodiments of reason that there could be no question of making them accountable to the rest of the political community. However, one can see the remnants of the idea of the rule of reason in the Nocturnal Council and in the body known as the Guardians of the Laws. Political decision-making is still in the hands of the wise. Although there is private property and families, excessive wealth is not allowed and everybody sits down to meals together. Another remnant from Republic is Plato's advocacy of public offices for women as well. It can be argued that Laws should not be interpreted as a text in which Plato gives up his theory of forms and of the rule of philosophy. Laws reveal, instead, a modification of those positions to make it possible to administer not an ideal state, but a practicable state. Moving beyond Plato, every criticism is an interpretation, and we have already seen how fraught with pitfalls the interpretive task is. Are we decided on our interpretation of Plato? Was he mainly a political thinker, or was he basically doing philosophy with an emphasis on epistemology and ethics? One has to go no further than Aristotle to look for hard-hitting criticism of many aspects of Plato's thought. Of the many criticisms that Aristotle makes in Book 2 of Politics, and which have been further developed by others later, let us pause by just a few. Plato's political theory was tainted with elitism. Political decision-making in Plato's ideal state was in the hands of a few philosophical rulers. No doubt, Plato was certain that these rulers would always be oriented towards the common good. However, he was so strongly elitist that not only did he believe that the vast majority of human beings simply lack sufficient reason to decide important things for themselves, he also considered them incapable of judging the adequacy of the decisions of their rulers. By using the idea of reason to put individuals into different categories, Plato was also attacking the democratic institutions of Athens. Plato has been sharply criticized by Karl Popper for using the theory of unchecked sovereignty of the philosopher rulers to undermine the idea of an accountable government. 41 For other critics, philosophy as a form of political knowledge became, in Plato's hands, a means of suppressing politics itself. For these critics, Plato's proposal that the vast majority of the denizens of the ideal city unquestioningly follow the regulations of the philosophers also undermined his own project of developing their moral selves. In all these different ways, then, Plato is being accused of undermining his own fundamental value of justice. Focusing on reason as a human attribute and on the role of reason in human life is valuable, but Plato went wrong, critics charge, not only in restricting reason to a few, but also in developing, when describing the reason of these few, a concept of a totally ungrounded reason. For Plato, reason has nothing to do with either human experience or our emotions and passions. This is no longer seen to be an adequate conception of reason, and it fails to capture the process of the development of human reason. The political repercussions of seeing reason as the opposite of interests, passions, emotions, or experience can also be unsettling. Given all these problems, although the idea of reason remains a central category for political thought, later philosophers, beginning with Aristotle, give us a different picture of how human beings can use reason to arrange their affairs. Central themes. 1. The use of justice to fit the individual into the community. Plato seems to argue that in human life, most substantial results are due to collective effort, and sustained collective effort is not possible without some norms of justice being in place. What is the conception of justice that he unfolds? Does he use his conception of justice to mitigate the conflict between individuals and the community? 2. Reason and experience in a theory of knowledge. Reason is said to be the linchpin of Plato's philosophic vision. The rational structure of the cosmos can be recreated by human beings in their social universe when they follow the light of reason. Do you think that Plato's conception of reason can be used in a theory of social reform? 3. Democracy and the rule of philosophy. It is quite clear from Plato's writings that he had a jaundiced view of Athenian democracy. What do you think of Plato's warning that democracy often descends into a rule of demagogues, or, in modern parlance, populist rule? In trying to mitigate the ills of the democracy practiced in his times through his conception of the rule of philosophy, what is it that Plato missed? 4. Women and politics. Plato said that men and women were different by nature, but their natural differences were, unlike the differences between farmers and guardians, irrelevant to their political roles. What problems do you find with Plato's theory of the political equality of men and women? 5. The public and the private. In Plato's times, Athenian men spent most of their day in public spaces, in the gymnasia, the agora, the ecclesia, and the academies. Plato took this association with the public to another level when he condemned the institutions of private property and the family for the guardians. What was Plato's purpose in denying the pleasures of property and of family life for the guardians? In Plato's conception, are there any private aspects of life, for instance in how knowledge of the good is gained, for those who are most closely associated with political decision-making?